It's hard to ignore the constant buzz around sanctuary cities these days. They're just everywhere in the immigration debates.
They really are, raising some fundamental questions about how the country handles immigration enforcement.
And for you, who wants to get a solid handle on complex topics quickly without, drowning in details, well, you're in the right place.
Today, we're taking that deep dive into sanctuary cities. We've got quite a mix of sources for you.
Yeah. What are we looking at?
We've got legal analysis from the Columbia Law Review, also the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal. Then there's an economic study by Alexander D. Nathanson.
Okay, economics.
Yep. And a broad overview from Wikipedia, just for context, plus a recent Politico poll on public opinion.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So our mission today is basically to cut through the noise.
Exactly, to really get to the heart of these sanctuary policies.
Understand why they exist, the legal fights around them, and what they actually mean for communities, for the economy.
Consider this your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on a pretty complicated issue.
All right, let's dive in. First things first. What does sanctuary city actually mean? It sounds specific, but is it?
That's the key question to start with. You hear lots of terms, right? Sanctuary cities, welcoming cities, sometimes just jurisdictions with certain policies.
So it's not one single definition.
Not really a strict legal one, no. But the core idea, the common thread, is local governments choosing to limit how much they help federal immigration authorities.
Limiting help. How so?
Mostly, it means deciding not to use local resources like city police or county funds to ask about someone's immigration status, or refusing to hold people in jail just because IC asks them to, based on an immigration detainer.
Okay, so it's about limiting proactive help. It doesn't mean zero cooperation at all.
Precisely. That's a really common misunderstanding. It's not like they build a wall around the city.
Right.
For instance, when someone's arrested, their fingerprints almost always go to the FBI anyway. And the FBI shares that data with DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. So ICE can still identify people. The difference is whether the local police are actively helping ICE find or detain them.
Got it. That distinction's important. The word sanctuary itself, though, it has this older, almost historical feel, doesn't it?
It really does. You think of, like, churches in the Middle Ages or something.
Exactly.
And yeah, the idea of offering refuge, a safe place, goes way back. Ancient times, biblical references, places people could seek protection.
But it's not the same thing today.
Well, that's the crucial point here. The scope and the intent are fundamentally different. Ancient sanctuary was often about protection from immediate violence or specific legal pursuers.
Whereas now
It's about broad government policies related to federal immigration enforcement systems. Much bigger scale, different legal context. It's an analogy, but not a direct parallel.
that makes sense. Quick aside, you mentioned Wikipedia, just a heads up for you listening. The source noted its page needed an update back in November 2024, so things might have evolved slightly since then.
Good point. Always good to check the date.
Okay, so some places adopt these sanctuary-type policies.
Yeah.
But it sounds like there's been pushback, a sort of counter-movement.
Oh, absolutely. The Columbia Law Review piece really focuses on this. They talk about a new wave of state anti-sanctuary efforts.
State efforts, specifically.
Yes, and this brings in a concept they call immigration localism.
Immigration localism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what's that about?
Well, traditionally, legal fights over immigration often focused on federalism, the balance of power between the federal government and the states. Think Arizona SB 1070 challenges, things like that.
Like state versus feds.
But immigration localism shifts the focus. It looks at the relationship between states and their own local governments, cities, counties.
Why is that relationship so important here?
Because legally, cities are often seen as creatures of the state. Their powers come from the state.
Ah, so the state can basically tell them what to do.
In many areas, yes. States can limit local authority or even preempt local laws. This makes cities vulnerable to state laws requiring them to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, even if the city doesn't want to.
We did see cities fighting back against the federal government, though. I remember Chicago, Philadelphia, Santa Clara County. They sued over the Trump administration trying to withhold grant money.
Yes, exactly. Cases like City of Philadelphia v. Sessions, City of Chicago v. Sessions, those were big.
County of Santa Clara v. Trump, too.
Right. Those cities challenged the executive order and the conditions the DOJ put on federal grants. They argued the feds were overreaching.
And they had some success.
They did. Several federal courts actually issued injunctions stopping the federal government from enforcing those anti-sanctuary conditions on the grants.
On what grounds? What were the winning arguments?
A couple of key things. Some courts found Congress hadn't actually given the president the authority to put those specific conditions on the money.
So a statutory argument.
Yes. And others relied heavily on the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Which says?
Basically, the federal government can't just force states or localities to use their own resources to enforce federal law. They can't commandeer local officials.
Okay, so federal efforts hit roadblocks. But the Columbia Law Review says now the action is shifting to the states. Why are state anti-sanctuary laws proliferating if the federal ones stalled?
That's the really interesting part. The argument is that state laws are sort of legally different. They cleverly sidestepped some of the arguments cities used against the feds.
How so?
Because a city is a creation of the state, it's much harder for a city to argue that its own state is commandeering it by passing a state law about immigration cooperation.
The city can't use the anti-commandeering argument against its own state government in the same way.
Exactly. Or claim the state is violating state sovereignty principles in the same way they could against the federal government. It puts cities in a tougher legal spot when challenging state mandates.
That's a really significant shift in legal strategy. So let's say, hypothetically, Congress did pass a law saying, localities, you have discretion, you can choose whether or not to help ICE.
Okay.
Could that federal discretion override a state law that says, no, locality, you must cooperate?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the Columbia Law Review is pretty skeptical.
Really? Why?
Because, again, of that state-local power dynamic, the state grants power to the locality. It's unlikely a federal law could just carve out an area of local autonomy that directly contradicts a state law governing that locality's function.
It might even violate anti-commandeering from the state's perspective.
Potentially, yes. Or just general principles of state power over its own subdivisions. It gets very tangled legally.
So if federal protections like anti-commandeering aren't as strong against state laws, what options do sanctuary cities have? Where do they look for legal support?
The Law Review suggests they really need to lean into this localism framework. They have to look at their own state constitutions, state laws governing local power, the specific legal relationship between the city and state in that state.
So fighting state law with arguments based on state-level structures and rights.
Pretty much. Exploring state-specific legal avenues to protect their policies rather than relying solely on federal constitutional claims.
It's kind of ironic, though. You hear both sides, the federal government trying to mandate cooperation, the states trying to mandate it, framing their actions as being for the good of the local community.
That's a really sharp observation. Yeah, everyone claims to be helping locals, right? Improving safety, boosting the economy, whatever the justification is.
It really raises the question, doesn't it? Who is actually in the best position to decide what's best for a local community regarding immigration enforcement?
Is it the state capital or Washington, D.C.? Or is it the people on the ground, the local government, that actually deals with the day-to-day costs and consequences, both social and financial?
Yeah, the local costs are definitely borne locally. It really gets to that core issue of local control. Okay, let's pivot a bit. Let's talk economics.
Right. The Nathanson.
Alexander D. Nathanson study. It looked directly at the economic impacts of sanctuary policies versus more enforcement-heavy ICE policies. How did he go about studying that?
It's a pretty sophisticated approach. He used county-level data census data on things like income, jobs, GDP, and combined it with ICE data on where different enforcement policies were active.
Okay.
And crucially, he used what economists call quasi-experimental variation. Basically, looking at counties that adopted policies at different times, comparing them to similar counties that didn't or that adopted them later, it helps isolate the policy's effect from other factors.
Like a natural experiment, almost.
Kind of, yeah. It's a way to get closer to cause and effect.
So what did he find? Did sanctuary policies help or hurt the local economies in his analysis?
The results were pretty striking, actually. His research indicated that sanctuary policies providing these protections were linked to increases in several key economic indicators.
Increases? Like what?
Higher per capita income overall, higher wages, growth in GDP, and more total employment at the county level.
Wow. And unemployment?
Unemployment actually decreased in those counties.
So the study suggests sanctuary policies are good for the economy.
That's certainly what Nathanson's data points towards. It's not just that they don't harm the economy, which is one argument you hear. This study suggests they actively boost it.
That definitely runs counter to some narratives. What about the flip side? The counties with more punitive ICE policies?
There, the picture was different. He didn't find a statistically significant effect on income or unemployment, positive or negative, but he did find negative effects on other measures. Lower GDP, lower total employment, and even a decrease in the share of the population that was foreign-born in those counties.
Interesting. So, economically speaking, this study leans towards the sanctuary approach being more beneficial. How does Nathanson explain that? What's the proposed reason?
He frames immigration policy as a type of local institution. It can either support economic activity or suppress it.
Okay.
His argument connects the benefits of sanctuary policies to creating more stability and reducing uncertainty for immigrants.
Makes sense. Less fear, perhaps?
Exactly. When people feel more secure, less afraid of sudden deportation, they're more likely to fully participate in the economy. Invest, start businesses, use their skill, their human capital more effectively.
Right. If you're constantly looking over your shoulder, you're probably not focused on long-term economic contribution.
That seems to be the idea. Reduced fear optimizes human capital and boosts overall productivity.
Now, the study defined sanctuary county based on policies identified by the ILRC, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. What were those specific policies?
Yeah, they used a checklist of 7 policies. Things like, does the county have a 287G agreement? That's where local police act like immigration agents.
Okay, so not having one would count towards sanctuary status.
Correct. Others include not having contracts to detain immigrants for ICE, honoring ICE detainer requests, restricting information sharing with ICE about release dates, limiting ICE access to jails, prohibiting police from asking about status, and just generally not assisting ICE operations.
And how many did a county need to qualify?
The study classified a county as sanctuary if it had at least 4 out of those 7 policies in place in a given year.
Got it. And these policies haven't always been around or applied uniformly?
No, the study notes the timing varies. Things like 287G agreements and detention contracts really picked up around 2006 onwards, so the policy landscape has definitely shifted over the study period.
And study included visuals, maps, and charts.
It did. Figure 1 is a map showing which counties had various ICE policies in 2019, giving you a geographic picture. Figures 2 and 3 track the number of sanctuary counties and counties with ICE contracts over time, from 2006 to 2018. You can see the trends, how many counties adopted, which type of approach.
And Figure 5 sounds important, showing economic indicators diverging.
Yes. Figure 5 is compelling visually. It plots things like unemployment rates for different groups, women, Latinos, whites, plus median family income, Latino household income, white household income.
Comparing sanctuary counties versus ICE contract counties.
Exactly. And it shows these lines starting to diverge, to separate, right around year 0, which marks when the policies were implemented. The sanctuary counties tend to trend upwards on positive indicators, while the ICE counties are flatter or trend downwards.
That visual really drives the point home. Did the study look at urban versus rural differences? Sometimes policies have different effects depending on the setting.
Yes, that was another interesting finding. Nathanson found that per capita income went up in both urban and rural sanctuary counties, whereas there wasn't a significant income effect, positive or negative, in either urban or rural counties with the ICE contracts.
So the benefit wasn't just an urban thing.
Apparently not. He even found rural sanctuary counties saw income rise compared to similar rural counties that adopted the policies later. It suggests the positive effect holds across different types of communities.
Fascinating. Okay, let's bring it back to more recent events and public perception. The Wikipedia source mentioned ongoing legal stuff, and that political poll gives a snapshot of where the public is at.
Right. The legal battles definitely haven't stopped. Wikipedia mentions Orange County in California suing its own state over California's sanctuary laws.
So a locality challenging a state sanctuary law, the flip side of what we discussed earlier.
Exactly. And also a federal judge in Chicago ruling against the federal government trying to withhold those public safety grants we talked about. So these fights continue in the courts.
And what about social impacts, like crime? Any mention of that?
Yeah, Wikipedia references a couple of studies. One from 2020 found California's big sanctuary law, SB 54, didn't have a significant impact on crime rates overall.
Okay.
But another study from 2021 suggested Latinos might have been more likely to report crimes after sanctuary policies were in place, perhaps feeling safer interacting with police. So the picture on social impacts is complex, maybe even debated.
And the public seems pretty split based on that Politico poll.
Very much so. This was an April 2025 poll. It found President Trump had a 53% disapproval rating on his handling of immigration. That's a majority, but still shows significant division.
Any specific issues polled?
Yeah, they asked about specific scenarios, like should someone wrongly deported be allowed back? A plurality said yes. Should alleged gang members be sent to El Salvador without a hearing? A majority said no.
So people's views are maybe more nuanced than just pro or anti-immigration across the board.
It really suggests that. Public opinion seems conflicted, complex, not easily fitting into simple boxes, especially when you get down to specific situations.
It really feels like this whole issue is constantly moving, legally, politically, and in how people think about it.
Absolutely.
Which brings us back to that Columbia Law Review idea of immigration localism. Feels like their main point is that we really need to pay attention to what's happening within states now.
That's the core takeaway, yeah. The battleground is shifting. It's not just feds versus states anymore. It's increasingly states versus their own cities and counties, or even cities within a state disagreeing.
And they argue localities need to use localism arguments to defend their choices.
Precisely. To push back against state anti-sanctuary laws, they need to leverage legal arguments based on their specific powers and standing under state law.
And they pointed to examples like in California, where some localities actually sided with the federal government against California's state sanctuary law.
Exactly. Places like San Diego, Orange County, some other cities, they challenged the state law, kind of mirroring those older preemption challenges against things like Prop 187 in California or SB 1070 in Arizona.
Has the federal government had much luck joining those challenges against state sanctuary laws?
Interestingly, the article notes the federal government's own legal challenges against California's law haven't been very successful so far.
Huh. So it seems the arguments about municipal empowerment, the power and autonomy of cities, they could potentially be used both ways. Cities in anti-sanctuary states might use them to argue for cooperating with feds, while cities in sanctuary states might use similar arguments to resist state laws mandating cooperation.
That's a really sharp insight from the Columbia Law Review piece. The legal tools around local power aren't necessarily partisan. They can be deployed by localities on different sides of the issue, depending on whether they're trying to align with or resist state or federal directives.
Wow, okay. This has been incredibly useful in untangling a really complex web.
It's a lot to track.
Definitely. So just to recap for everyone listening, we've seen how the legal landscape for sanctuary cities is changing, with states becoming major players through this immigration localism.
We looked at economic research suggesting these inclusive policies might actually benefit local economies, boosting income, jobs, and GDP.
Right, and we touched on the fact that public opinion is still very much divided and nuanced, and legal fights are far from over.
And it's just so crucial to remember this is all still evolving. Court rulings keep changing the rules, public attitudes shift. It's a dynamic process.
That interplay between federal, state, and local power over immigration enforcement is clearly ongoing, with real stakes for communities everywhere.
Absolutely.
So maybe here's a final thought for you to chew on. Given all this conflict, federal versus state versus local, and knowing the real economic impacts happen locally, what role should communities ideally play? How much say should a city or county have in shaping immigration enforcement within its borders? What does local control even look like in practice when it comes to an issue this big, this charged?
That's the fundamental question to grapple with, isn't it?
Definitely something to think about.
And we really do encourage you, if you want to go deeper, check out those sources directly. The Columbia Law Review, Georgetown Immigration Law Journal articles, Nathanson's economic study, the news pieces.
Yeah, they offer much more detail on the specific legal points, the economic data, and all the ongoing developments we've touched on today.